Hello music lovers, welcome back. We've got this little Rominimal house vibe going on here, because if we're going to be discussing and showing reverbs, I figured we'd need a genre with a lot of space. Now, if you're not a DJ, imagine you are one for a minute, and we're going to transition this track into the next section with some reverb. I have two reverb options for you, and I'd like you to tell me which one does the better job. Here's number one. Okay. And now here is number two. Which one did you prefer? So, after my delay video got you all thinking about delays a little bit differently, a lot of you asked for a follow-up on reverb. Makes perfect sense. They do generally serve a similar function, ambient effects. However, what most of you appreciated on the delay video was how I approached it rather musically, treating delays as extra rhythm. Whereas for reverbs, I don't actually have that much of a musical approach. If you clicked on the video for rule of thumb tips like setting your reverb time to 2 beats long, etc., I'm afraid you won't find that here. We will discuss why that doesn't work later on. Instead, I have more of a producer's approach to reverb. It's still a different way of thinking than most, and I think you'll find it refreshingly useful. And the concept is simply this. There are only two types of reverb. Let's discuss. Now, don't worry, it's not a clickbait title. This is something I use in my day-to-day work, and I think it will be a great way of streamlining your production and engineering decisions. So, what are the two types? It's real or fake. I class reverbs as either real verb or fake verb. Now, this isn't just determined by the effect itself, it's also determined by your application of the effect. As I discussed in the mixing tutorials rant, tools like EQ have got to the point where it doesn't really matter what you use. Not unless you're a dedicated engineer, pulling in $10,000 a mix anyway. It's a similar story with reverb. Whichever you choose is going to be good enough. The real difference maker these days is how and why you choose to use it, and therefore which of the two camps, real or fake, it falls into. I did the same thing in my kicks video, separating them into just two kinds. Sure, you can call me a binary thinker with no appreciation of nuance, but trust me, it's these kind of hacks built from years of experience that saves a lot of that chin stroking over things that don't matter, especially if you're new and or suffering from choice paralysis. So, reverb, what is it? We should probably clear that up before we go any further, right? Reverberation is just the sound of your environment. It's basically part of our auditory system. As sound bounces off the walls and surfaces of a place, our brain decodes all those echoes to determine the position of a sound in space, its distance and direction, for example. So, unless you have ever visited something called an anechoic chamber, for your entire life you have never heard a single sound without reverb. As for the effect itself, on a basic level, it's created how you might imagine. It's lots and lots of delays, or echoes, or bounces, if you will, and they become so fast, numerous, and dense that they become this wash we know as reverb. In fact, a great example of this is Valhalla's free Supermassive plugin, which is a delay that can become a reverb. As you should be able to hear right now, we have this delay on 16ths. And as I vary up the timing with this warp dial here, and add more of them with the density dial, you'll hear it turn into a reverb. In fact, some older and cheaper digital reverbs had a certain character because they couldn't afford to run enough delays. So you could still hear the distinct echoes, like you could hear in the original Waves Reverb, which I've got a sample of here. So which is which? Well, there are some telltale signs which you can look out for, which give away what type of reverb it's trying to be. One of those is early reflections, or ER for short, because one of the hardest things to simulate from real life is those initial bounces off the walls, with all the chaos involved with the different timings and frequencies and phase variations. Those little details are actually what we rely on to locate sound. We're naturally sensitive to them. If we weren't, we wouldn't have survived this long as a species. So, you'll find reverbs which are trying to be realistic often have parameters dedicated to early reflections. As you can see on the Tone Boosters reverb here, we have a dial for ER. Now, early reflections are distinguished from late reflections because early reflections are classed as what we call correlated sound, meaning the reflections still have something in common with the original sound. They're still recognizable. Whereas the late reflections, the reverb tail, those are what we call uncorrelated sound because by the end of the tail, they are diffused, meaning basically they're one big blur by that point. Almost just noise, and therefore uncorrelated to the original sound. Here's another example on the Aural River plugin. You can see we have dedicated parameters to ER. This type of variation over here is basically simulating different room shapes, and we also have a dedicated level over here. Here's how it sounds on its own. So there's two examples of what I would class as real verb. You can make them do other things, obviously, but I think not what they were designed for. Now, my favourite reverb for early reflections is ironically Proto-Verb by Yuhi. I say ironically because Proto-Verb doesn't have any dedicated ER parameters. It's actually just a random reverb. It's a dice roll, effectively. But when it rolls well, these can sound great. These sound like convincing simulations of small room reflections to me. So that's early reflections. One of the other parameters to keep an eye out for is called dampening. Again, the Tone Boosters has this one also, and the Aural River. Let's look at that. Here we have frequency and amount. What this is attempting to do is simulate the loss of high frequencies as sound moves through air. Now, this parameter can appear on other reverbs, as it is rather useful for getting rid of high frequency rattle, but using it is going to result in a more realistic sounding reverb tail. As the reverb decays, it gets duller and duller, which for me is one of the main distinguishing traits between a real verb and a fake verb. So keep an eye out for early reflections and dampening. Two signs that the reverb is trying to be a real verb. So, why would we choose to use a real verb? Well, as I touched on earlier, reverb is natural. It's how sound exists in the real world. So we can use a real verb to sit a sound in 3D space. Sometimes there are sounds which you can't get to fit because they sit in this uncanny valley from being too dry and they stick out awkwardly. It's especially the case when you find samples of real instruments. For example, a saxophone sample that's been recorded in a vocal booth. They sound clean, but unnaturally so. Another use is to get that front to back 3D depth in your mix, as a good real verb algorithm should fool our ears into hearing distance. Now, that's all well and good when it comes to simulating real spaces, but not all sound is necessarily real sound, especially in electronic music, like a synth, for example. Yes, it can be musical, producing recognizable pitch, but it's not a sound that exists in nature, and therefore doesn't have to be treated realistically either. Okay, so what about the other kind? Fake verbs. Well, that's literally everything else, to be honest. Fake verbs move away from the territory of realism and more into the territory of sound design. They can have very unnatural or abstract tails, and we can use them to add character and interest, or completely change a sound, in fact, if it's part of the sound design itself. They're an especially good fit for non-natural sounds, like synths, or basically most sounds in electronic dance, to be honest. As you heard in the intro, we had our two competing reverbs for transitions. Number one was the fake verb, and I think that did a much better job. Now, because fake verbs are not following any laws of nature, we can use their more flexible tails to do other effects, like kick rumble. Or how about gated reverb? I also include delays in this category somewhat. One of my go-to fake verbs has to be Tal, Reverb 4. It just has a very universally useful default sound. A nice, clean, bright, fake tail. Another one I like for different reasons is AD Verb by Audio Damage. Here it is. This is trying to emulate one of the old digital plate devices. One of the first, I think it's the EMT 250. Again, nice bright tail. And of course, we already heard Valhalla's Supermassive. Now, because fake verbs aren't concerned with early reflections and realism, they tend to be less correlated by default. So they're less distracting, as our ears aren't trying to deal with locating the sound, and therefore can take up less space in the track. That's another reason they're great for sound design, as you can use them as effects for effect's sake, without messing with your balance or front to back too much. Also, because they're not concerned with modeling air absorption, they tend to have unnaturally bright tails, which means they won't be as easily masked by other sounds in your track, which means you can keep them at an overall lower level whilst still being audible. In my house drums tutorial, I talked about the concept of sound shape as a way of judging sound. And I see real verb versus fake verb in a very similar sense, generally. Here's a visual representation of what I'm talking about. A spectrogram of a typical example of each type. On the left there, you can see the real verb has stronger early reflections and the tail that dulls over time, whereas you can see the fake verb is almost the opposite. Practically no early correlation. It's brighter for longer, more than is possible in real life. The tails can be less blurry, less diffused than real life as well, like I showed you with that cheap digital reverb earlier. Now, in terms of emotional impact, either reverb can be used to either soften the vibe, because we're effectively lengthening notes, right? So less percussive overall as an energy, or it can be the opposite, because it sounds like sound is bouncing off walls, it can add energy. Now, as for why I do not calculate my reverb tails to beats or seconds, the short answer is masking. Let me explain. In audio science terms, the reverb tail time is known as the T60. You can see that term here on the Tone Boosters reverb. And all that means is it's the time taken for the sound to decay by 60 decibels. Now, in the context of a track, you're not going to hear a reverb tail that's 20 or even 15 decibels down, never mind 60. And that's because of masking. Masking just means if two sounds are at the same frequency, the louder one is the only one you can hear. So, as you might be able to imagine, it's all dependent on what sounds in your track are covering what parts of the reverb tail. And as the reverb tail is not just losing level over time, it's changing in tone. So a single measurement of time for that total reverb tail doesn't tell us very much. This is why we have to go by ear, which again is an emotional decision. So next time you see a tutorial telling you to time your reverb tails in beats or seconds, raise one eyebrow very high and say with me in your best attempt at a London accent, "You serious, bruv?" While we're here, let's close out with some top tips, shall we? If you are new to this, let me give you one universal rule of thumb which will keep you out of trouble. Take the lows and highs out of your reverbs. Tracks with very busy extreme highs and extreme lows tend to just sound very messy, especially in a club. So get rid of the lows and highs out of the reverb signal, or else you end up with this kind of thing. And for those of you who aren't so new to this, then here's a tip for you lot. If you play underground genres like Rominimal, minimal house, or deep house, underground, techno, etc., let me remind you that you are going to be playing in smaller venues. Pay attention to both your reverb levels and what you're putting reverb on. Keep all that in check because you're going to be playing in smaller rooms and therefore much more real-life room reverb. And trust me, verb on verb doesn't usually sound great. Now, speaking of Rominimal, for those of you with a certain type of beard, yes, those of you who already typed in the comments at the start of the video that this isn't authentic Rominimal house, let me just remind you that I am not a DJ. My job is that I work for DJs. This is just me dipping my toe in, having a bit of fun, trying stuff out. But if you do have some expertise to share, please, by all means, I'm all ears. Leave it in the comments. We are all always learning, so let me know what you know. Anyway, regardless of your beard type, I hope you learned something. If you did, you know what to do. And until next week, I will see you in the comments. Bye-bye.